Welcome to No Longer Conformed, where we're studying the book of Acts. In this session, we'll look at Acts chapter 27, verses 1 to 44, Paul's witness during the shipwreck. Here's the account of Paul's own Mediterranean cruise. He went on a cruise from Caesarea to Rome. And there's some intriguing ports of call along the way. Luke gives more detail in this passage than in other travel accounts in this book of Acts. What is the theme of Acts chapter 27? Well, I would say it's the providence of God. Verse 24 of Acts 27 says, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar. And indeed, God has granted to you all those who sail with you." God delivered Paul and all who sailed with him for the ultimate purpose of witness before Caesar. Remember Acts chapter 1, way back there in verse 8, Jesus giving his witness that it begins in Jerusalem, goes to Judea and Caesarea, and then to the uttermost parts of the earth. Well, as we come to this chapter, approaching the end of the book of Acts, Acts chapter 1 is reaching its finale destination, the end of the earth. The gospel is triumphed, not the servant, but the message. And that's what's important. The curtain came down on Acts with Paul in chains. That's the last we see of him. He's still in jail. The imagery of the storm is so important because you see, each time the situation gets most desperate, a word of encouragement comes from God. Well, let's join the cruise as it departs from Caesarea. First, the voyage began. Acts chapter 27, verses 1 through 8. "And when we decided that we should sail to Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to one named Julius, a centurion of the Augustan regiment. So entering a ship at Adramyttium, we put to sea, meaning to sail along the coast of Asia. Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us. And the next day we landed at Sidon. And Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him liberty to go with his friends and receive care. When we had put to sea from there, we sailed under the shelter of Cyprus, because the winds were contrary. And when we had sailed over the sea, which is off Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy, and he put us on board. When we had sailed slowly many days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, the wind not permitting us to proceed, we sailed under the shelter of Crete, off Salmone. Passing it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near the city of Lasea. They stopped in Sidon, they stopped in Myra to change ships, and Fair Havens, as the winds were getting rough. Those named on the trip were Paul, Julius, Aristarchus, and Luke, of course, when he says we. Verse 3 is interesting and a bit strange. It says Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him liberty to go to his friends and receive care. It's kind of cool that Paul had freedom for ministry while in chains. Kind of reminds you of Joseph when he was in prison. And he had freedom, and he even had responsibility over other prisoners. So then there was a warning that was ignored. Verse 9. Now when much time had been spent, and sailing was now dangerous because the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, Men, I perceive that this voyage will end in disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also our lives. Nevertheless, the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman and the owner of the ship than by the things spoken by Paul. And because the harbor was not suitable to winter in, the majority advised to set sail from there also. If by any means, excuse me, they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, opening toward the southwest and northwest, and winter there. Paul tried to help and offer advice, but the experts had more influence than the truth. That brings up a question. When you end up in a crisis, where do you turn for counsel? Do you turn to the truth of God, or do you turn to the wisdom of this world? Because you see, the experts of this world's wisdom and skill are often contrary to the spiritual guidance of God's Word. And so, as predicted, the storm appeared. Verse 13. When the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had attained their desire, putting out to sea, they sailed close to Crete. But not long after, a tempestuous headwind arose, called Euroclydon. So when the ship was caught and could not head into the wind, we let her drive. And running under the shelter of an island called Clauda, we secured the skiff with difficulty. When they had taken it on board, they used cables to undergird the ship, and fearing lest they should run aground on the Syrtis sands, they struck sail, and so were driven. And because we were exceedingly tempest-tossed, the next day they lightened the ship. On the third day, we threw the ship's tackle overboard with our own hands. Now, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest beat on us, all hope that we would be saved was finally given up. Could they be safe in the crisis? Would the crew and passengers be spared? Is God's promise true or not? Jonah's fish belly voyage comes to mind at this point. The narrative is very similar. What is different? Jonah's presence brought the storm. Paul's presence reinforced deliverance. So the focus changed. In verse 21, then a word of encouragement was received by the apostle from the Lord. But after long abstinence from food, Paul stood in the midst of them and said, Men, you should have listened to me and not have sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster and loss. And now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only the ship. For there stood by me this night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, Do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar, and indeed God has granted to you all those who sail with you. Therefore, take heart, men, for I believe God that it will be just as it was told me. However, we must run aground on a certain island. Paul got in a little bit of, I told you so, but he had their attention. A very captive audience. The apostles spoke before of disaster, but then his words were of deliverance, God's providence, a new prediction. Verses 25 and 26. Therefore take heart, men, for I believe God that it will be just as it was told me. However, we must run aground on a certain island. And then, fifth, the plan was revealed. Verse 27. Now when the 14th night had come, as we were driven up and down in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors sensed that they were drawing near some land. And they took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. And when they had gone a little farther, they took soundings again and found it to be 15 fathoms. Then, fearing lest we should run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, when they had let down the skiff into the sea, under pretense of putting out anchors from the prow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the skiff and let it fall off. Desperate times will drive people to their knees. It says it prayed for day to come. Listen, God will make a way, but usually not the way that you imagine or expect it will be. In lifeboats, makes sense, right? No. There's no glory for God there. Were they finally listening to Paul? Well, look again, verse 31. Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the skiff and let it fall. Verses 33 to 38 contain even more encouragement. And as day was about to dawn, Paul implored them all to take food, saying, "Today is the 14th day. You have waited and continued without food and eaten nothing. Therefore I urge you to take nourishment, for this is for your survival, since not a hair will fall from your head, from the head of any of you." And when he had said these things, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. Then they were all encouraged and also took food themselves. And in all there were 276 persons on the ship. So when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and threw out the wheat into the sea. And then the deliverance was provided. When it was day, verse 39, they did not recognize the land, but they observed the bay with a beach, onto which they planned to run the ship, if possible. And they let go the anchors and left them in the sea, meanwhile loosing the rudder ropes. And they hoisted the mainsail to the wind and made for shore. But striking a place where 2 seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable, but the stern was being broken up by the violence of the waves. And the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim away and escape. But the centurion wanted to save Paul, kept them from their purpose, and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest, some on boards and some on parts of the ship. And so it was that they all escaped safely to land. What was God's way of deliverance? Shipwreck. An important principle of truth here in this. God delivering through shipwreck. Life through death. Think about that in the context of Calvary's cross. Turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18 in your Bible. For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, "I will destroy the wisdom of the wise and bring to nothing the understanding of the prudent." Where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the disputer of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through wisdom did not know God, it pleased God through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe. For Jews request a sign and the Greeks seek after wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified. To the Jews a stumbling block, and to the Greeks foolishness. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. Because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. Isaiah chapter 55 and verses 8 and 9. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. You see, God used the centurion to save Paul's life for his special purpose. God's ways don't make sense to us because his thoughts are not as our thoughts. You have a great day.